Welcome to part 4 of the Dagr pit light instructions. For part 4, we'll begin by doing the pivot prep before we install the pivots. First, you'll begin by disassembling the pivots and setting aside the internal sleeve for later. We're removing the sleeve so that the tightening and adjusting of the pivots is a lot easier later in the build. The internal crush sleeve tends to get in the way of tightening, so removing it now is critical in order to assemble later in a more efficient and effective manner. Once the sleeve is removed, you'll be installing one M5 by 10 button head on each side of the pivot. You'll notice that the pivot may have some assembly grease, so now is a good time to possibly add a little bit of grease. However, final grease and assembly can be done later, as we'll be reinstalling the crush sleeves further down in part 4. Keep in mind that with part 4, we will continue to build 3 complete daggers, so we will show more than what you really need to see. However, with building the extra daggers, you do get exposure to different ways of assembling the components at various stages, and then also extra time to pause, rewind, and rewatch some of the content. Please also keep in mind that there will be limited audio in the second and third iterations of the builds that we continue with in part 4. You'll notice that we're prepping and building the pivots without the adjusting arms. This is a lot easier to do later, as the adjusting arms may get in the way as you're attaching the left and right legs to the center section. However, feel free to pre-watch the entire part 4 and see what works best for you. However, with feedback not only internally but with customers, we found that leaving the pivot arms off for now is best. One thing to keep in mind when installing the pivots later in part 4 is that you will want to position the head of the screw outward, so that if you do need to later adjust or obviously take it apart to install the crush sleeve, you're able to do so. Otherwise, if it's facing the other way, you'll run into interference with the other components of the light. So just a heads up. However, we'll cover that later as well. Okay, all of your pivots are now prepped and ready for installation. Now that we've built 4, we'll speed through the next and make sure that we keep moving on and keep you going through your build. Now that your pivots are prepped, they're ready for installation on the top shelf. We're showing an overview right now of Dagr number 0 to show where these pivots will go and how they look on the final assembly. Okay, here we go with the right side of the top shelf. We'll begin here with the pivot installation and show you step by step how we go about it. Keep in mind during installation that the pivot bolt, the flathead that keeps the pivot together, needs to face outward. This is so that you can adjust, take it apart, and such without any interference of the bolt head facing inward. When installing the T-nuts, you can do so by running them onto the pivot screw itself or sliding them into the rail first and then tightening from there. The approach that you take will depend upon what works best for you. However, we'll show various ways of pre-installing the T-nut into the rail or running it onto the screw first, leaving room for it to then slide onto the rail together. During this part of the installation, you will first want to align the pivots with the end of the rail that they're being mounted to. This is a good starting point, however, there will be some adjustments needed later in the build. For the right side, we're referencing rail D. Okay, it looks like the right side is now complete. We have the pivots in place, flush with the end of rail D, and tightened, not fully tightened, I guess to say, but at least snug for now until we proceed to the right leg installation. Before that, we'll move on to the left side pivot installation. Next is the left side pivot installation. The pivots for the left side will be mounted onto rail E. Same as before, you can use various techniques in order to install the T-nut first into the rail, or you can run it onto the pivot itself first, leaving room for them to both slide on together. You'll notice for the left side that it's going to be much easier for you to flip over the top shelf and work on it upside down. In the next scene, you'll see me flip the top shelf and restart the installation with it upside down. Now with the top shelf upside down, we can begin the pivot installation onto rail E. Notice the orientation of the pivots and where they install on rail E. The pivots will install on the outer side of rail E towards the end of the light. If you noticed on the right side, the installation was on the inner part of rail D. When installing the pivots on the left side, you will align them to the end of rail E flush, just as you did with the right side with rail D. Keep in mind that later on in the build, the pivots may need to be adjusted widthwise to match the legs during installation. However, we will go over this in detail later. Okay, the left side pivots are now installed and complete as far as we go in this step. Next we'll show Dagr build number 2, and then after that, Dagr build number 3 for the pivot part of the installation. Feel free to skip forward or continue watching the second and third iterations of the pivot installation. Alright, here we go with the second Dagr build. In this part, we'll be installing the pivots just as we did last time. We'll be reviewing the right and left side for number 2, and we'll be doing the same for number 3. Keep in mind that the audio for the second and third builds will be limited. However, we will continue to display the text instructions as we proceed. Again, feel free to skip forward if you need to. Okay, the right side of build number 2 is complete as far as we go in this step. So now we'll proceed to the left side for number 2. Okay, here's dagger number 3. We'll start this one off just as we did with the last two and go with right side first, and then we'll do the left side installation of the pivots and then proceed from there. All right, all three daggers now have pivots. So we'll proceed to the next scene with an overview of the top shelf again, and then we'll move on from there to installing the first left leg of the first dagger. Okay, here's a little bit of an overview of the top shelf and the pivots that we just completed with one of the daggers, and it's paired up with dagger number 0 as an example. Take a look. Okay, now we're ready to install the left leg onto the first dagger. There's going to be a few different ways that you can do this, and we will cover those in the iterations later in this part. However, for this first one, what we're going to do is flip the dagger upside down, as you see in the video, and then pre-install the T-nuts onto the pivots, and then slide the leg from essentially the bottom up, if you will, or top down now that the top shelf is upside down. One quick measurement update to make before proceeding is to readjust where rail F is set on rails A and B. In the first part, we instructed you to set it at 1 inch. However, it should be set to 7/8 of an inch from the end of A and B. As you're sliding the leg onto the pivots, if there's any issue with alignment, feel free to adjust the pivot width now versus doing it later. The alignment should be super close. However, there might need to be fine-tuned adjustments in order to get the legs and pivots to align correctly. And then later on, upon swing of the leg, needing it to pass by the shelf and other components. We'll go over that later. When installing the left leg, keep in mind that the leg itself, specifically rail M, should be resting on rails A and B when assembling. You may need to prop up the top shelf in order to gain clearance in order for rail M to rest on A and B. However, that is exactly where A and B need to land upon final adjustment. So keep that in mind during the build now and then final adjustments later. You'll notice that the method I chose for the first part, or I should say the first dagger in this assembly of the left leg, is not the greatest. However, again, we're going to show a few different ways in order to install the left leg. So keep that in mind in case this method isn't working out. Feel free to proceed to the second and third iterations to gain more insight and different ways of installing the left leg. Keep in mind that when tightening, that you may need to tighten and loosen and confirm that the pivot is landing completely flat onto the rail. So don't be afraid to make minor adjustments, again with tightening and loosening, to ensure that the mating surfaces are completely flat. You'll see me moving around and struggling a little bit in this first iteration. However, it does show that anybody with advanced or intermediate experience or beginner experience may struggle during the build in certain occasions and certain parts. So don't get frustrated, keep going. keep adjusting, and you'll gain a flow and a process in which to assemble efficiently and effectively. Okay, the left leg installation for the first dagger is now complete. You'll see me doing some fine tuning adjustments. However, when the left leg is installed, it should be pretty close, if not exactly perpendicular to the top shelf. However, if it's not, don't worry about it. We will make some adjustments, and I will provide some tips later on what to do and what to move around in order for that leg to land correctly where it should. In the meantime, we'll move on to the right leg installation and go from there. Okay, now that the left leg is installed, we'll move on to the right leg. Keep in mind, again, there will be several different ways or a few different ways of installing the right leg. However, we'll show one way for this first iteration and then go over a few different ways and adjustments later. For this leg, notice how I start with the dagger top shelf right side up. From there, I'll pre-install the T-nuts and then slide the right leg essentially top down. As I'm sliding it through, what I'll do is then flip the dagger upside down to essentially hold the leg in place and allow me to tighten and adjust more efficiently and effectively. Keep in mind that, again, for this step, your pivots should be super close, if not exactly where they need to be. If not, don't be afraid, just go ahead and adjust them as needed in order to get the right leg installed, and then fine-tune adjustments will be done a little bit later. As with the left leg, the right leg should be perpendicular to the top shelf after installation is complete. If not, then we will make some adjustments later. Typically, if the leg isn't swinging far enough open or is swinging too far open, then the rails K are typically what needs to be adjusted, as that can be a stop for the leg or the cross member itself on the upright. The cross member I'm referring to is rail L. So adjusting either or both can adjust how far the leg swings open, whether it's going too far or not far enough. Okay, the right leg is on and complete as far as we go in this step. We'll move on to dagger build number 2 and installing the left leg of that one. For dagger number 2, we changed the camera angle so that you can get a slightly different perspective, and then you'll also notice that the installation is going to be different than the first dagger that we built earlier in this part. So take a look. If you're complete, feel free to move forward. If it's helpful for you to watch regardless, feel free to watch how we do this part of the build and then move on from there. And there you go. The left leg for dagger number 2 is complete as far as we go in this step. For the next scene, we'll be including a left leg alignment supplement. In this scene, we'll be showing some adjustments that I'll be making and highlighting some of what we're doing and what you should do when adjusting your dagger so that the legs are in proper alignment and can swing without interference on rails A and B. In this supplement, I'll show the adjustment of rail F so that it is properly installed onto rails A and B. Earlier in the build, we thought that setting it at 1 inch was preferable. However, you want to set rail F at 7/8 of an inch from the end of rails A and B. This adjustment will increase the width of the light slightly, but also make it so that the outsides of the leg upright are aligned with the ends of A and B. You'll notice that I'll show this in the video as I'm highlighting what I'm adjusting and then how the outer edges of the upright align with the ends of rails A and B. In this next part of the leg alignment supplement, you'll see me using a combination square in order to see how square or aligned the uprights are to each other and to the light itself. If the legs swing and there's any kind of interference where they rub on A and B, it's most likely due to maybe they're not fully tightened, maybe they're only snugged. If they are tight, maybe the mating surfaces aren't completely flat and square to each other. So, using your hex wrench, double check the tightness. If they are tight, give them a little bit of a wiggle. Maybe there's some surfaces that aren't quite mated together, so the brackets might not be fully engaged. So tighten, loosen, adjust. You'll also see me spread apart the two upright legs slightly in order to gain some movement and adjustment in the brackets. Feel free to do this. Don't use too much force, however. You can bend the brackets, bend the rails, or cause other damage when doing that. However, if they do move apart, it's most likely due to them already being loose anyway. So that's part of the alignment process and part of what you kind of need to work through and adjust as you're fine tuning how the legs swing and if there's any interference, how you're able to solve for that. Now, with the supplement complete, we'll move on to the number 2 dagger and install the right leg. All right, now that right leg number 2 is complete, we'll move on to dagger number 3 and install the left leg. In this scene, we'll show the installation of the left leg for dagger number 3, and then immediately after this scene, we'll show another supplement for adjustments. Now that we have the right leg on, we're going to proceed with the rail F adjustment. Remember that earlier in the series we suggested that the rail F should be 1 inch inset from the ends of rail A and B. However, 7/8 of an inch is preferable and suggested as an update to this measurement. We did this previously in this part 4 series, however, we are showing it again for the next dagger. All right, left leg for dagger number 3 is complete, as well as the rail F adjustment. So to wrap up this part of the dagger, we'll move on to right leg number 3 and go from there. Last but not least, we'll show the right leg installation for dagger number 3. In the preceding scene, as a heads up, we will show some adjustments and show them candidly as we work through them and the tools that we use and the process that we go through. Okay, dagger number 3 now has a right leg and is complete as far as we go in this part of the series. We'll proceed again with the fine tuning of the dagger in the next scene and show you what we work through, the tools that we use, and some of the process that we go through for adjustments. So, as your dagger is nearing completion, there's definitely going to be a possibility that you're going to have to make some adjustments. As you see in the video here, the left leg swings up, or actually that's the right leg because it's flipped around, swings up and rubs on A and B. Same with the other side. So definitely going to have to make some adjustments. Don't be afraid to, again, tighten, loosen, double check the brackets. You'll see that I'll be using the combination square again here to ensure that the measurements as denoted previously have stayed and are still true and square. Through the build process, again, if something is left loose, you think it's tight, and possibly the mating surfaces aren't exactly square, that bracket might not actually be tight. So things might loosen as you go. You might forget to tighten something, so on and so on. So at this stage, during the adjustments, you're going to want to double check the measurements that we pointed out earlier. Double check that the mating surfaces are flat, that the brackets are flat to the rails that they are attached to, and adjust as needed in that regard. Now, as far as the swing of the legs and if they rub on rails A and B, or if at full extension the legs are not perpendicular to A and B, there's a few things that you can do. So regarding the swing and rubbing on rails A and B, it's typically due to the ends of the legs being pitched inward. Since the legs are relatively long in comparison to the overall width of the light, they can become slightly unstable at the very ends. So it's critical that the legs are exactly square so that when they do swing, there's no interference. So to ensure this, you're going to want to go to the internal L brackets that hold the longer upright rails to the shorter crossbar. Ensure that those pieces are square to the mating surfaces, so rail piece to rail piece, and then also ensure that the measurements are still adhered to and that the bracket is indeed tight and nested within the rails. So again, tightening, loosening, double checking, squareness, measurements, and so on as you go for each piece will ensure the squareness overall for the dagger itself. So try not to loosen too much at one time and work on one side of the dagger and then move to the other side. Since each leg is independent of the other side, your adjustments for one side can affect how the other side stands in relation to how level it is. However, each leg's pivot is independent of the other side, and the adjustments in that regard that you make will only affect each side that you're working on. One other mention for the swing of each leg is also the spread of the pivots and how they are attached to the top shelf and how they're attached to the upright. So in case there is a possibility of the leg being offset from one side to the other, meaning that the allowable space on swing is favored from one side to the other, you might have to move one or both pivots and then adjust the leg as well to essentially provide you the same amount of gap on one side to the other so that you have room for that swing to happen. So double check that your pivots are where they need to be, and then make sure that they're of course tight, nice and snug, all the mating surfaces are square, and so on and so forth, and adjust from there. So some of your adjustment for how the swing and interference happens also depends on the pivot itself. as I adjust the upright, you'll see some of my hand motions in the video, but what I'm trying to point out here is that although the legs and pivots were pretty square to start the build, they did move, and you'll see me having to move the upright essentially, I guess forward and back of the video to adjust the alignment. And you can see, I keep moving the uprights from collapsed to extended to see how it acts each time. And as you can see here, the alignment, you can see the gap where the pivot is. You can see that little gray gap from the mat there. And then if you look at the end of the leg, you can see there's no gap. So the upright as it is on there now is slightly pitched entirely to one side, causing some alignment issues. So you'll see me using also the tape measure to kind of assist in some of the measurements where the combination square doesn't fit or work too well. So keep in mind you can use various measuring tools and methods to check the squareness and adjust from there. As you proceed through this portion of the video, you'll see me constantly moving the uprights from extended to closed, fine tuning, double checking measurements, so on and so forth. And this is probably a bit of an extended version of adjustments that I think you'll need to make. It depends on how the build goes for you and how snug and square everything was during each step of the process. However, like I said, this is kind of a candid view of how we went through a lot of the adjustments, what we're doing, trying to provide some hand motions here to guide you and really kind of what's going on. But really, it's just, looking at each component one piece at a time and verifying the squareness and how all the surfaces mate. That might sound like a broken record, but when you're putting so many pieces together with brackets and hardware and dealing with tolerances from the manufacturing, the cutting, and processing, and so on, it's critical to take all these measurements and get it as good as possible from the beginning so that there's no interference issues during use. There's no need to make any major adjustments later, and try to cross your T's and dot your I's now before proceeding too far. Not to say that you can't make adjustments and fine tune later or fine tune as you use it, but it's always nice to start off with a nice square light and get a good start from there. As you can see here with the left leg pretty much square. Swings real good, isn't interfering with A and B. All the pivots and brackets are nice and tight. All the mating surfaces are nice and square and flat. We move on to the other side. So this is where not only does the leg stop plus the leg crossbar come in contact with A and B, but this is also an opportunity for adjustments. So as you're extending and collapsing the leg, as far as it becoming perpendicular to A and B, and then obviously as well as the surface that you're working on, those adjustments for how the leg extends comes from those two pieces. Next, as far as the alignment, you're going to do the same thing that you did on the other side. So it's verifying that the pivots are in the correct location, mounted to not only the upright, but also the mounting to the top shelf. You want to ensure that there isn't any kind of bind, or you also want to ensure that there's gap between the upright itself so that it swings and doesn't interfere with A and B. You can see me pointing that out now, and then giving a thumbs up. It looks pretty good, I guess, and then adjusting from there. Here you'll see me pointing out the crossbar on the upright contacting A and B, which is preferable. The leg stop is also there as not only a leg stop, but also extra bracing to give it more rigidity. So find what works best, but we found that the crossbar stopping on A and B seemed to work the best as far as our builds. So not to say that your build's going to be really any different. However, there's a possibility that somebody might want to customize or change something in some sort of alteration method or what have you. So you do want to contact the leg with the crossbar first, and then now you'll see me adjusting the other rail essentially as an additional stop, but really mostly there for additional bracing for the light itself, or I should say for the upright. Okay, now that the dagger is adjusted, square, nice and tight, everything aligns, there's no interferences, we can move on to the rest of the build. From here, we won't be showing any more adjusting on the other two daggers as that would just be overly redundant. So we'll move on next to an overview of the dagger, and then we'll move on to greasing the pivots, and then on from there. Okay, here's a quick overview of the dagger we just adjusted, and it's sitting next to dagger 0, just as a comparison. So next we'll move into greasing the pivots, and then the remainder of the build. Okay, in this part of the series, we'll show greasing the pivots and reinstalling the sleeves. It's important to reinstall the sleeves as they act as a crush sleeve, not only when just using the flathead bolt, but also when using the quick adjust arms. For this, we'll show using a waterproof grease made by Maxima. We chose this grease just because it's readily available. We use it on a lot of things, not only RC related, but otherwise. The waterproof grease is also nice to prevent any kind of contamination from moisture. We definitely don't recommend using the dagger in rain elements or high moisture areas, as the lighting fixture isn't necessarily rated for outdoor use. So keep that in mind. However, if you're not using a fixture with your dagger, or you're using an outdoor rated fixture, then all the better to use an out, or I should say a waterproof grease in this scenario. Keep in mind that this is a good opportunity to double check your pivots and ensure that they are indeed tight, not only on the top shelf but also on the uprights. So once installing the sleeve, it can be quite hard to navigate to the button heads that attach the pivots to the rails. So this is an important part of the final assembly steps. So keep this in mind as you're moving along, and try not to forget if you can. If you're sure that you've already tightened them, no big deal. Keep on with installing and greasing the sleeves, and moving on from there. All right, the sleeves and pivots are now greased and complete. So we'll move on to the next part of the build, which is installing the feet. So check out the overview as compared to Dagr number 0, and we'll go on from here. In this next part, we'll show the installation of the feet. The feet are the black small L brackets made out of aluminum, and these little brackets add additional stability to the dagger itself. Positioning can be up to you as far as where you want to put them, and then also if you want to install them or not. So depending upon your available space, how you're going to use the dagger, and so on, you can install these or not. We do recommend to install them if space permits, as it does add stability. Now, as far as orientation, we do position the feet on the outsides of the uprights. Of course, being four-sided profiles, if you wanted to, you could position these in different ways. However, upon swing, just keep in mind if the feet were mounted towards the inside of the uprights, that they would interfere as the legs swing up. They would contact rails A and B at that point. In addition to the original shooting of the video and the release of the latest batches of daggers, we are now including plastic feet. These plastic feet would go on the bottom side of each upright. So we include 4 feet that are made out of plastic and would protect the bottom of the rails against the work surface. So because of how the profiles are processed, some of the edges might be sharp. We do try to keep that in mind when doing quality control. However, beyond that, it's possible that the profile can scratch your work surface depending on what it is. So the plastic feet will help in that scenario, and simply just press on from the bottom and protect the bottom of the profile from the work surface that it's resting on. Okay, the feet are now installed, and if you chose to install them, I should say, and as well as the bottom plastic feet protectors. So we'll show a quick overview and then move on to the next major step, which is installing the light fixture. So here we'll show the installation of the light fixture, and to start off, depending upon where your outlet's going to be, which side you want to consider, left or right, the light fixture can go on either way. So you can have the cord on the left or the cord on the right. We choose to build our daggers with the cord on the right hand side, just for how we use them. So to begin with, what we do is we set up a string of tape, or 2 strings of tape I should say, on one of the rails A or B, in order to hold the light in place as we work on it. From there, we'll want to prep the hardware, which is the 25mm button heads, the 1/2-inch plastic spacer, and the 2 T-nuts. So you'll see me here now strapping the light fixture to the dagger to position it in place. Now, as I tape up the fixture, I want to account for the space that I need to insert the spacer in between the fixture and the 2 mock bracket that you'll see me pointing out there. So that bracket is the bracket you installed while building the top shelf and has both sides machined flat. So as we move along, you'll see me inserting the spacer and then retightening the tape. And then from there, I'll slide in the T-nut. The T-nut goes into the slot on the ends of the light. You'll see that there's a cutout, a rectangle cutout, and then you slide the T-nut in from there. Once the T-nut is inserted, the plastic spacer is in place, you can then drop the M5 by 25 button head from the top down and start screwing it into the T-nut. Keep in mind that the T-nut isn't a nylock. However, in this case, we haven't had any kind of loosening of that bolt, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about Loctiting it. However, if you wanted to, we do suggest either using pink Loctite or blue Loctite, and try not to over tighten as well. So when tightening that M5 by 25 bolts against the T-nut, just keep in mind that you're tightening this entire assembly against the plastic from the light fixture itself, which is thick enough for use, but can be on the thinner side if you crank on it too much. You might squeeze that plastic too much and cause premature fatigue in that area. So just be careful when tightening, but you want to make sure it's nice and snug, so nothing loosens or comes apart at that point. Okay, we have the left side wrapped up now, and we'll move on to the right side of the fixture. The right side will require basically the same steps as the left side, so carry along the same methods as far as having the fixture taped in place for assistance. Make sure there's enough room to slide in the 25 or half-inch spacer in between the fixture and the bracket, the 25 millimeter hardware, and so on. Keeping in mind not to over tighten the 25 millimeter button head against that T-nut because of the plastic there. So again, right side will be basically the same as the left. Okay, the right side of the fixture is now complete and fully installed onto your dagger. So, with this being the last step, congratulations, the dagger is now fully complete. However, if you did order a carbon fiber blinger kit, that will require some extra steps. However, now that you've built your dagger and you've gone through all of the build steps, that's essentially something extra if you bought one to add on next. You can also add on your serialized dagger plate at this point as well. We don't show the steps for that because the placement and usage of that serialized plate is entirely up to you. However, if you did order a dagger, you have a serialized plate specifically made for you, and that's the order in which we sold and produced the dagger. So, with that said, congratulations, and here's an overview of the three daggers that we built during this process. And you'll notice some of them do have the carbon fiber kit installed. Actually, in fact, all three for this shoot have them included. So now that your dagger is complete, one of the options and extra brackets that we provide are for leg locks. Leg locks essentially secure the legs so that they cannot fold under use. To install these on the right hand side, you simply just drop the L bracket into one of the upright legs, either the one closest or furthest from you. You'll do this on the inside part of the rail profile, and the set screw will go vertically on that L bracket. On the left side, you'll take the second leg lock and slide it up vertically on the inside of the upright profile. You can do this on either leg as well, and the set screw goes on the vertical part of the leg. One reminder is to not forget that your leg locks are in place when you try to collapse your dagger. If they're in place and locked down securely, just make sure to loosen and remove before trying to collapse and transport your dagger. We want to thank you for your purchase and for watching the complete dagger build series. If you have any questions, concerns, need any kind of support, please reach out and email us, and we'll do our best to help you along with your build. Thank you again, and enjoy your dagger, and we'll see you at the track.